Hey guys, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 31 of the Ecce textbook titled Pseudolus. Now in this chapter, the main grammar point we're going to look at is coming back to the passive voice and understanding how to make a passive infinitive. We're also going to do a quick review of the ablative case just to get all the different uses down, and then we're going to come back and learn two new demonstratives. To start though, let's take a look at the chapter 31 derivatives. So the first word we want to look at is optimus, which means best. Now, in English, you get a lot of words that come from this, like optimal, optimist, or optimum. They all have to do with the idea of the best. Next, we have caro carnis. Now, this is the word for meat. And if you look at the genitive form carnis, this is where we get a lot of English words that have to do with meat. Words like carnivore, carnage, incarnation, carnal. They all have to do with that idea of meat or flesh. Next, we have pretium, which means price. Now, this is where we get words like appreciate, appraise, depreciate, precious, praise. They all have to do with the price of something in one way or another. Next, we have multus, which means many or much. And in English, you get words like multitude, multiply, multiple, basically anything that has that multi prefix. And we've seen this word before, so these derivatives should sound familiar. Anything with multi on it has to do with many or much of something. Next, we have pinguis, which means fat. Now, in English, you get a word pinguid, but you also get the word penguin, which is a fun derivative that comes from this. This type of fat is not talking about being big necessarily, it's talking about the fat that you would find on meat. So that's really where they're going with it. Next, you have the verb minuere, which means to lessen or reduce. Now, in English, we get a lot of words that have to do with lessening something. Words like diminish, minute, diminutive, even menu. They all have to do with reducing or getting something smaller. And that's really what we're after. Even the word minus in English, if you think math class, is related to this. So it should be a pretty easy one to spot the derivatives on. Next, we have recte, which means rightly or correctly. And this is where you actually get the word correct from, the R-E-C-T at the end of correct. It comes from this word. The same with rectify, which is another one. It has to do with correcting something or making something right. Next, we have vero, which means truly. And this is where you get the word verily in English. It's related to the Latin word veritas, which means truth. So you can see the connection there. Next, we have the verb pascere, which means to feed or to nourish. In English, you get words like pastor or pasture. And if you think of a pasture, it's where you send animals out, think cows or something like that. You send them off to eat and feed and graze. That's where you get this word from. Next, you have addere, which means to add. And just like minuere, which means to lessen, there's some English words that come directly to us from this. Words like add, for instance, if you think math class. Additive, addendum, addition, they all have to do with adding something. Next, we have accepere, which means to accept. And in English, we actually get the word accept right from this, right? So receiving or accepting something comes from accepere. And again, this is a verb we've actually seen before. So now we want to move on to the grammar part, which, like I said, is present passive infinitives. So we're going to take a step back to start and think of what are infinitives, what have we learned, and then we're going to learn how to put them into the passive voice. So here's our quick review of infinitives. You want to remember that since early on in Latin, I think in chapter 4 of the Ecce textbook, you've learned about infinitives and how they're basically generalized forms of verbs. They don't have any person attached to them. So instead of saying I, you, he, she, it, or anything like that, it just means to do something. That's how we translate them. And you can always recognize them because they have that RE ending. So for instance, one of the first verbs we learned was ambulare, which means to walk. But just like normal verbs, infinitives have a passive voice and they can be used passively. So far, all the infinitives that we've seen have been active voice. So if you look at these sentences, right, for instance, Aurelia pseudolum ad villam mittere volet. This means Aurelia will want to send Pseudolus to the house, right? Our infinitive here is mittere, to send. That's what we've been seeing so far. But if we switch it up, and now we have Aurelia pseudolum ad villam miti eubebit, we've changed it around a little bit, right? This means Aurelia will order Pseudolus to be sent to the house. So again, the first infinitive in our first sentence is mittere, it's active voice, to send. But if in the second sentence you have miti, which means to be sent, this is the passive infinitive, and this is what we're going to be looking at in this chapter. So in the passive voice, the infinitive ends in a long I instead of an RE. And we translate passive infinitives as to be blank, right? So again, passive voice always means that the subject isn't doing the action. So if I were to say to you, oh, I don't want to be sent to the house, I'm not actually sending anything, something's happening to me. That's how these infinitives work in the passive voice. So to form a passive infinitive, you just change the ending around. So you take the RE of the active voice infinitive, change it to a long I, and you're on the right track. The only exception that you want to think about is in third conjugation. In third conjugation, you drop the entire ERE, remember it'll be a short ERE, and you replace it with a long I. So here's a chart of all 4 conjugations and third IO, and what they look like with active and passive infinitives. And again, you'll notice that in first, second, and fourth conjugation, all we did is we changed that final E to a long I. And in third conjugation and third IO, we replaced the entire ERE with a long I. So these rules, if you lock them down and just keep them in the back of your mind, you should be able to pretty easily flip between active and passive voice when you're dealing with infinitives. And pay attention to the translations too. For instance, in the third conjugation, ascendere, to climb, in the passive it would be to be climbed. That's how we translate the passive infinitive. So the second grammar topic we want to talk about in this video is just a review of the ablative case. Up to this point, we've seen about 7 different ways that an ablative can be used. It's a really complicated case in Latin, so we just want to take a step back and make sure that we can process all the different uses of the ablative. So here's our quick review. And again, like I said, the ablative case is the most versatile in Latin. It's got a lot of uses, right? In chapter 30, you learned about the ablative of agent, which is what we use with passive voice verbs. So now that we added another layer to the ablative case, we just want to take a step back, review all of them, and keep them straight in our minds. So the first use of the ablative that we want to look at is the ablative of time when. So if we look at this example sentence, you'll see illo ipso tempore is explaining when the walls of the apartment building fell, at that very moment. This is one of the uses of the ablative that we've seen. The second is similar. It's the ablative of time within which. And just like the ablative of time when, it's explaining the time within which something took place. So in other words, in this example sentence, when you have brevi tempore, it means in a short time. I'm kind of giving a range of time when the mother and her daughter were being carried through the streets, right? That's the idea. It's sort of taking a chunk of time and saying my event happened within this time. And again, it's just another use of the ablative. The third use that we've seen is the ablative of means. And again, so far, throughout the book, we've been seeing that the ablative is used to express how something was done. So in our example sentence here, complexu means in an embrace. I'm saying Cornelia holds Flavia how? Well, she holds her complexu in an embrace. The fourth use that we've seen is the ablative of manner. And this use of the ablative is when you're trying to express the way in which something was done. So if we go to this example, we're saying the walls of the apartment building fell magno fragore, with a great crash. So again, it's answering how something fell, or in this case, how the walls fell, but it's kind of getting at the idea of the way in which they fell. And that's one of the other uses of the ablative. The fifth use of the ablative that we've seen is the ablative of cause. And this is used when we're trying to express the cause of something being done, or how or why something happened, the cause of it. So if you look at this example, we have tua culpa, because of your fault, or by your fault, the rider is in the ditch, right? That was one of our famous lines from earlier on in the book. The carriage was stuck in the ditch for a few chapters. The reason why is tua culpa, because of your fault. I believe Cornelius says this to one of the slaves, right? It's your fault that the carriage is in the ditch. It's explaining the cause of something, right? Why is the carriage in the ditch? Because of your fault. The sixth use that we've seen is the ablative of price, and this really came up in this chapter with Pseudolus going off to the butcher and trying to buy meat. We have, this idea of expressing the cost of something. So in the chapter, we had the line, itaque tibi decem denarii eum vendam, right? I will sell it to you for 10 denarii, right? That way of explaining the price of something, we use an ablative to do that. The word decem, 10, we don't decline, so it just stays decem, but denarii is in the ablative plural, right? So for 10 denarii, that's the price of, I believe, the ham Pseudolus was trying to buy. The last use of the ablative, and this is one that we've just seen in the past 2 chapters, is the ablative of agent. And this is when you're trying to explain who is doing the action when it's a passive voice verb, right? So in our example here, you have ab inculis, right? Everything is being done by the tenants. The verb aguntur is passive voice, so the way that we express who is doing the action is with this ablative of agent. And you're going to see the preposition a or ab in front of the ablative noun. So even though the ablative case It definitely can feel overwhelming at times. You just want to try to think of these basic uses and translations. Usually, a good general rule of thumb is to translate it with by, with, from, and on. Now, obviously, that doesn't work all the time, but it'll at least get you moving in the right direction. At the end of the day, what you want to do is when you see a noun in the ablative case, just try to think of these 7 uses and figure out why is it in the ablative case? How is it being used in this sentence? So this brings us to our last piece of the grammar for chapter 31. It's a return to demonstratives. And you've seen a few of these before. Specifically, we saw hic and ille, and that's how we say this and that. Now you're going to get 2 more, ipse and idem. So just to do a quick review, like I said, demonstratives are pointing words, showing words. It's from the Latin demonstrare, which means to point out or to show. And you learned hic and ille, which means this and that. We're going to add 2 more. They work very similar. You want to remember most of the time these are adjectives, so we're going to be thinking of case, number, and gender. But we have 2 more we're going to add. The first one we're going to see is ipse, ipsa, ipsum. And this is how we say himself, herself, itself, and themselves in Latin. The second is Eadem, Eadem, Idem, which means the same. So let's start with ipse. This word is what we call an intensive, right? Because it intensifies or emphasizes the noun or pronoun that it's describing. We translate these as myself or ourselves, yourself or yourselves, or him, her, itself, or themselves. And those are the singular and plural forms. And it depends on the noun that it's modifying, right? So you want to look for the case, number, and gender. That's how they're going to match. Whenever you're using these as an adjective, you have to match the case, number, and gender. So let's take a look at an example. If you said Cicero ipse laudavit me, you're saying Cicero himself praised me. And you want to catch the emphasis in this sentence, right? Cicero would obviously be a very famous Roman. So if someone were saying this, it's not just that, anyone praised me and it was Cicero, and not just Cicero, it was Cicero himself. Like the idea here is you're saying, can you believe Cicero himself actually praised me? That's the intensifying action of ipse. And you'll notice that we spelled it ipse because it's matching with Cicero, right? The case, number, and gender would be nominative, masculine, singular. So that's the idea. You just have to match them up, case, number, and gender. So here's our chart for ipse, ipsa, ipsum. And you want to notice that the chart follows the exact same pattern as ille, illa, illud. So you're going to get, for instance, in the genitive singular, the ending of long ius. We saw that before with ilius, right? You just want to memorize these. If you can think of ille, illa, illud, it'll help you to do the memorization. But we're just trying to use these like any other adjectives matching the case, number, and gender. So now we have Eadem, and we translate this as the same. And again, this word is pointing something out. It's not just any dog, right? It's the same dog. So if you're telling someone a story, you might say something like, I saw this dog walking down the street, and then an hour later I saw the exact same dog, right? When you say the same, you're using the demonstrative Eadem in Latin. This one is very common, right? And what you do with this is you take the pronoun is, ea, id, which we learn means he, she, or it, and you stick dem on the end of it. There's a couple of little tweaks, right? So in other words, idem in the neuter instead of the 2 Ds there. But in general, that's how you form this word. And you want to pay attention. The exception is that we use the N instead of the M in front of the dem. And I'll show you what I mean in the chart in a second. But just to give you an example, if you had eodem tempore, right, you're saying it was at the same time. You're really emphasizing that word time, and you're saying, yeah, it was at the same time at which you will get down from the litter, ... and you keep on going with your story. This is how you use this word. So now we have the chart for Eadem. And pay attention again, like I said, it's the same idea as is, ea, id. We're just putting a dem on the end of these words. And there's a few exceptions. But the main one that you want to notice is you have the letter N in front of the dem instead of an M. So in other words, in the masculine accusative singular, the pronoun we learned was eum with an M. Now it's eundem with an N. That's the trick you want to pay attention to. So specifically the accusative singular, and then the same thing is happening in the genitive plural. If you memorize these charts though, they're not too bad. They function just like any other adjective, right? You can use them as pronouns as well. But in general, you're going to be seeing them as adjectives. Just think case, number, and gender.